Ever get that feeling? Like you're scrolling and scrolling through reviews and you're just totally overwhelmed. Phones, laptops, even just trying to pick a new coffee maker, it can feel impossible to actually choose.
It's the paradox of choice.
Yeah.
Too many options and we freeze up.
Yes, exactly. Like you're drowning in choices and you just need a way to make sense of it all. Well, on that note, today's deep dive is all about making insightful comparisons because whether we realize it or not, we're constantly comparing things to figure out the world around us and make decisions, right? And this guide we're looking at today breaks down how to make those comparisons work for us, not against us.
And what's interesting about comparisons is that it goes beyond just listing differences. Like they can help us understand really complex issues, weigh potential outcomes, even when it comes to things like personal growth.
I like that. Okay, so then where do we even begin? When we're trying to make a solid comparison, I see this guide jumps right into it, and the first thing it highlights is that it's not actually about finding differences, it's about choosing the right things to compare in the first place, which seems obvious, but I can see how that's easy to mess up.
Yeah, you absolutely can. It's like, that saying, you can't compare apples to oranges. Well, I mean, technically you can compare them if you're clear about what you're comparing. Like if you want to talk about sweetness or the juiciness, even like nutritional content. But if you're trying to decide which one makes a better doorstop, I mean, good luck with that comparison.
Uh-huh. Oh, man. Yeah. I can think of a few times I've gone wrong there already. Okay, so choosing the right subjects, that's our first hurdle. What comes after that?
So once you've got, your contenders all lined up, you got to establish your criteria. It's like setting the rules of the game, like what matters most in this specific comparison. So, for example, let's say you're trying to decide between two job offers. Your criteria might include, I don't know, salary, benefits, commute time, what the company culture is like, things like that.
It's like you're creating a scorecard for your comparison, right? Like,
Yeah.
Here are the categories we're going to use to evaluate these things, but then wouldn't those categories totally change depending on what's important to you?
Exactly. And that's where comparisons get really interesting because we each bring our own values, priorities, and past experiences to the table. So what might be a deal breaker for one person, totally unimportant to someone else.
Yeah, that's so true. But then how do we make sure we're actually being objective about those criteria? It seems like there's probably a lot of like subconscious stuff that comes into play as well. And I noticed our guide mentions these cognitive biases. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, definitely. You see, our brains are kind of hardwired for efficiency, which, that's a good thing. Helps us avoid danger, like saber-toothed tigers back in the day, but not always super helpful when you're trying to make these rational comparisons.
Ah, okay, I get it.
Yeah, so all these cognitive biases, they're basically mental shortcuts. Often help us process information really quickly, but they can also, trip us up. Sometimes they make us jump to conclusions that aren't quite accurate.
Okay, so let's dive into these biases a bit. I'm seeing confirmation bias in the guide, and honestly, I feel personally attacked. Like, this is totally me.
Oh yeah, confirmation bias is a classic. It's basically our tendency to look for information that supports what we already think. Even if there's evidence that, maybe contradicts that belief, we tend to just brush that aside.
So is it kind of like when you get an idea in your head, maybe you've decided a certain brand is the best, just as an example, and suddenly you're only paying attention to the reviews or articles that say good things about it, even if there's other stuff out there saying the opposite?
Yes, exactly. Or let's say you're thinking about buying a new car, right? And there's this one specific model you've always loved. I mean, even before you do any of your research, you're already kind of leaning that way.
Yeah.
Then as you start looking at reviews and watching those car review channels online, confirmation bias might make you zero in on the positive stuff and just completely overlook anything negative.
Wow, yeah. It's like we're building a case for what we already believe, picking and choosing evidence. No wonder it's hard to be objective when we're comparing things. We've got all this other stuff going on in our minds without even realizing it.
Right. And that's why it's so important to, first of all, just acknowledge that we have these biases. I mean, we all do. It's part of being human.
Yeah.
But once you know that, you can start to find ways to counteract them.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Like, is there a way to outsmart our own brains? Or are we just kind of stuck with these biases? It really does feel like we need to train our brains to be more aware of these things. But how do we do that?
Well, I think, honestly, it starts with just admitting that we have biases. Like I said, it's human. But once you know that they're there, you can start to watch out for them a little. One thing that really helps is actually looking for different points of view, Like instead of just reading stuff from people who already love that brand you were talking about, see what people who maybe didn't have such a good experience have to say, or what people who like the competitor's product think.
So it's about challenging our own assumptions.
Yeah, I like that. And it actually kind of reminds me of something else I noticed in this guide. It talks about how cultural differences play a role in how we compare things, too. Oh, absolutely. Our cultural background really shapes our values and our beliefs, so it makes sense that it would affect the way we compare things. Like maybe a certain job is seen as super prestigious in one culture, but in a different culture, not so much. Or like the whole emphasis on individual achievement versus, more of a community-minded thing. That can be totally different depending on where you're coming from. And those different values definitely lead to people having different priorities.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that there isn't always one right answer when you're comparing things. It all comes down to the context and, like we were saying, what's important to you.
Exactly. And that's, I think, what makes mastering this whole idea of comparisons so valuable. It's not just about like making better decisions in the moment. It's about understanding the world around you and the people in it in a deeper, more, thoughtful way.
Love that. Okay, speaking of things that are valuable, our guide wraps up by connecting this whole idea of making comparisons to personal growth, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Comparisons, when you use them the right way, can be like a tool for growth. Think about it. Don't you ever compare yourself to like a past version of yourself?
Oh my gosh, all the time. Sometimes it's a good thing, like when I can see how much I've learned or how much more confident I am now than I used to be. But I'll be honest, sometimes it's really easy to fall into that trap of comparing yourself to other people, and then it's just not a good feeling at all.
Right. And that's the important difference, being aware of who or what we're using as our like measuring stick. So yeah, if you're always comparing yourself to other people, you're probably going to end up feeling inadequate, right? But if you can shift that focus to your own progress, that's when it gets powerful.
So more, look how far I've come, and less, look at what they have that I don't. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe last year running a mile seemed impossible and now you're out there training for a 5K. Or, I don't know, maybe you used to be terrified of public speaking and now you're giving presentations at work. Those are huge things. And acknowledging that progress could really boost your confidence and help you keep going.
Yeah, it's like we're celebrating the wins along the way, not just waiting to get to some finish line in the future. This whole deep dive has been so interesting. I've always made comparisons. I mean, who hasn't? But I never thought about the strategy behind it.
It's definitely a skill you build over time. The more you pay attention to how you're comparing things, the words you use, and even those little biases we were talking about, the better you'll get at it. And like we've been saying, it can help you make decisions, deal with tricky situations, and even just grow as a person.
This has been a serious light bulb moment for me. I'm going to be thinking about comparisons in a whole new way now. So for everyone listening, I have a little challenge for you. Next time you're comparing anything, maybe it's 2 different products or, I don't know, job offers or even what you're going to have for dinner, just take a second and think about how you're making that comparison. What are your criteria? Are you letting those biases creep in? You might be surprised by what you notice. And hey, maybe you'll discover you're a natural. This whole comparison thing could be a cool skill to add to the resume.
Right. It's all about being more mindful, like we've been saying. And who knows? Might lead to some interesting places.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive. This was a fun one.
It really was. Thanks for having me.